Hi everyone, Fran here. My guest on Hopenning this week is author and poet laureate of Montana, Chris Latre. Chris is the author of the book Becoming Little Shell. And in our interview today, we talk about what makes an Indigenous person Indigenous. Is it the amount of Indigenous blood they have? Or is it the relationship that they have with the people, the language, and the land? I think you'll find it enlightening, as I did, because as you see, it's a complicated thing. And his book, Becoming Little Shell, describes for us his journey to finding the truth. I hope you stay with me, and welcome to the Hopenning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hopenning. This is the place where hope happens when you open your mind and heart to new beginnings. And I welcome Chris Latre today. Bonjour is the way I would welcome him in his traditional language. Bonjour, Chris.
Bonjour to you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. Chris comes to us from Frenchtown in Montana, so across the border. But Chris, across the border, did not really exist until actually the late 1800s, right? It wasn't across the border. It didn't used to be across the border. It was just all one piece of land, wasn't it?
It was just home and still is. As I always say when I talk about being Métis and not being recognized in the United States, we didn't cross the border crossed us. So, yeah, we've been here a long time.
Yeah, the medicine line. So, Chris, you are a storyteller, you're Métis, you have Anishinaabe roots, but also Chippewa roots
Hmm.
as well. You've got a long history, and your book, Becoming Little Shell, is quite the read. It's quite the read of history about the becoming of the tribe that you do belong to. But that all started at your grandfather's funeral. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, it started before that, ever since I can remember, I knew we were Chippewa because my grandmother said so. And my grandfather and my father both denied our native heritage. So the book is kind of an exploration of how that happened and why, and my efforts to reconnect to our indigenous heritage. And, I was already in my mid to late 20s when my grandfather died in 1996, but it was there that at his funeral in this little church in Plains, Montana, where all of my relatives who I'd never met before kind of congregated to honor his passage into the next world. And, here's this church full of, very physically what we might think of as someone who looks like an Indian, though, that's kind of a slippery slope to go out on because what's an Indian look like? But here they all were, all of these other Latres that I allegedly wasn't related to. And, I was really struck then that because here clearly is this collection of people that dad and grandpa said weren't our family, yet they were. So that's when the wheels really started to turn for me in being interested in finding out, where we come from. But even then it wasn't for another, you know, almost 2 decades that I really got deeply involved in that research and recovery and reconnection and all the verbs for it.
Right. But from your 0 to 29, because your grandpa died when you were around 29 years old, you were raised like a white kid
Hmm.
outside of Missoula, Montana. So from 0 to 29, even though your dad, I'm not sure if he looked native, but he didn't act the part, right? He didn't celebrate, he didn't participate in the traditions, he didn't wear the regalia. So from 0 to 29, or until your grandfather's funeral, there was no connection with that side of the family. And so, what was it? Why was your dad so adamant or just disallowed any ideas of being an Indigenous person into his being or into his home?
There's a couple reasons for that, and it's not unusual at all. And in the majority of Indians live off reservation, so most of us live not connected to any kind of a traditional community. So in that respect, it was no different than the majority of Indians, even people enrolled with tribes. But in our case, we are our scattering is a diaspora because of the land we lost, in the Red River Valley and westward, going back 150 plus years. So all of those events coincide with just the kind of shame that is inflicted on Indian people as a result of the boarding school era. That there's just a checklist of reasons why people choose to deny their heritage. And in my father's case, born and raised in central Montana, he was born in 1940, and back then there were still stores with signs in them saying, no breeds allowed. We were called half breeds. So, he grew up in an environment where for a few generations, if you could pass for white, you did, just out of self-preservation. So it was a cavalcade of reasons for him to want to deny that.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's very similar here in Canada. Yeah, my own children, they're part Cree.
Hmm.
So, and they have cousins that they love, but they don't participate in any of that. I'm actually wearing my ribbon skirt
Oh,
in
sure.
yeah, in honor of this conversation that we're having. And I
Oh, that's
thought you
nice. I appreciate that.
and I thought you would because there's hummingbirds on it.
Hmm.
So I know that the last part of your book talks about your dream that you had of your
Hmm.
dad about 4 years after he died, and that dream of the hummingbirds and how important that was for you. You
Hmm.
kind of ended your book with that. So on your hand here, yeah, that it's 574, number 574. What's that about?
So when the little shell received our federal restoration, and what that means is that the United States government realized that they'd made a mistake in disenrolling us and reestablished their relationship with us as a fellow sovereign nation. We were the 574th tribe to be so recognized after, as I mentioned, 150 years of being known as the Landless Indians, because we'd been, you know, our lands had been taken from us, and we'd been disenrolled from the tribal community that we'd been part of for countless generations. And multiple generations devoted themselves to reestablishing that relationship. And so when it finally came, we were number 574, and I just wanted to commemorate it with a tattoo.
Yeah. And that 2020, is that correct? Or 2019?
2019, December of
2019.
2019. Yep.
You think about when those treaties were done. The treaty started, was it in the 1700s or the early
Mm-hmm.
1800s?
17.
Right? 1700s. So, and it took 150 some years to actually be recognized. And there's still no reservation, though. Your tribe doesn't have a reserve. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it boggles my mind because there's this idea out there that Native people, Indigenous people, are just the richest people ever because of all the casinos. I have friends that live in Washington State who this is what they see. They see the casino and they see all the rich. And actually in Calgary as well, there's stuff happening in Calgary close by because of oil wealth and what comes with that. But there's such disparity, Chris. There's so much disparity within that. This is all about hope. But when I look at that and I see, how can that be? How did we get here, Chris? I know your book is full of facts and figures and dates and the things that happened between the 1858 then the Sweet Corn Treaty, and just a little while after, land was taken back. Can you just go into that a little bit briefly about some of the stuff that happened? Because it boggles my mind that they got away with it.
Well, the Sweet Corn Treaty was never ratified. So, most tribes received their federal recognition as a result of treaties signed with the US government. That was the vehicle that recognized tribes as sovereign nations. But the United States stopped doing treaties and that recognition process in 1871. So if the Sweet Corn Treaty had been ratified in 1851 through 1858, then perhaps our status would have been different. But that treaty was never ratified, and it became the basis to identify the territories of the tribes that were involved. So it was that treaty that kind of identified what our traditional land was, which was North Dakota all the way to eastern Montana and down into South Dakota. But since that treaty never got signed and there was no official result from that, we never actually signed a treaty with the United States. So that's part of why we became landless. And then Chief Little Shell, for whom we were named, was responsible for the creation of the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. So we were, until the Turtle Mountain Reservation was established in 1882 or 1883, we were known as the Pembina Chippewa. And with the creation of Turtle Mountain in the early 1880s, then we became the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And it was the next decade where the United States was able to kind of shove Little Shell aside, and Little Shell and all of his followers and all of those related people were disenrolled from the Turtle Mountain rolls. And that's when we became the Landless Indians, which was like in the 1890s. So,
Right.
it's a complicated, very determined effort by the United States to take all that land.
And they wanted it because
Settlers,
settlers.
settler colonialism.
And because Little Shell refused to sign later, because in the space of just a couple of years, the government went from giving how many acres?
Well, so when the Turtle Mountain Reservation was established in the early 1880s, it was 450,000 acres. And then 2 years later, they shrunk it 90% to 45,000 acres, which is what it is today. And then when they came in the early 1890s for what's called the Macomber Commission, the Macomber Agreement, which is known kind of infamously as the 10-cent treaty, that is when it wasn't so much that Little Shell wouldn't sign, it's that he wasn't allowed to. So this guy Macomber came and wanted to buy a bunch of land from the Pembina, now Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And Little Shell recognized at that point that he was going to have to negotiate something because it was inevitable. And he wanted to make sure that we retained the Turtle Mountains. So Macomber had this plan to, because he knew he was going to offer 10 cents an acre, and Little Shell wanted at least $1 an acre. And so they made a plan where they identified Indians from the reservation who would play ball with him, who would participate in the negotiation, who weren't actually chiefs. And this is a process that had begun more than 100 years in how the United States would kind of divide and conquer tribes. They would pick who the chiefs were, regardless of whether the tribes themselves recognized. And that's what happened to Little Shell. So they negotiated with a bunch of people that weren't even allowed to make these decisions, who weren't recognized as leaders in the community. And Little Shell was not even allowed to participate in the discussion. So in the Macomber Agreement, the 10-cent treaty happens. That is when that 9 million acres is finally taken by the United States illegally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we just had a class action lawsuit settled from that commission like 2 or 3 years ago. And a number of us, received checks as a result of that. And I got $50.
Yeah, I read about that.
Mm-hmm.
And you bought
A buffalo steak. Uh-huh. So I was gonna get something traditional out of it. You can't buy a
right.
lot of land anywhere for $50, but you can get a pretty decent buffalo ribeye at the Montana Club, which is a restaurant here in Missoula.
then the railroad came through, right? The
Hmm.
railroad came through, and there were more settlers and industry as well, copper smelting and stuff, which polluted the land, which polluted the river, which forced Métis people out. So we talked a bit about the Chippewa, but for me, even, and even at my age, it's hard for me to know the difference between Métis and like a tribe like the Chippewa. So can you just describe that a little bit for myself and for our audience?
Well, there's not really a difference between Métis and Chippewa, though, Chippewa, Ojibwe, same thing. So, you have someone who is Chippewa or Ojibwe or even Anishinaabe, which is just an umbrella higher that multiple peoples fall under related through language and culture and stuff. You can have Chippewa, Ojibwe people who are members of multiple tribes, related. So you've got,
Oh,
a dozen Chippewa tribes across the high plains. There's the Little Shell now, there's the Turtle Mountain, and if you go into Minnesota, there's White Earth, and there's Red Lake, and all of those different people. We are all related as Chippewa, Ojibwe, as Anishinaabe people. We're all related, even though we're in different tribes. Métis are the same thing. So you have like the Métis Nation in Canada, and you have the Manitoba Métis Federation, who are big, organizations of Métis people. But like here in the United States, we don't have anything like that. So we have Métis people who are enrolled in the Little Shell tribe, who are enrolled in the Rocky Boy Chippewa Cree tribe, who are enrolled on the Fort Peck Reservation, who are enrolled on the Fort Belknap Reservation. So the tribes are just collections of a community of people from multiple ethnic or cultural backgrounds. So it's just like,
mhm.
you're Canadian, but it means you can have many different types of people in as a Canadian citizen. We have multiple types of people as citizens of the Little Shell tribe, and it's going to be mostly Chippewa, Cree, and Métis people, and some Nakota or Assiniboine. When we
Right.
start kind of breaking out these, it's a way we never really did it before. We were just communities. Now, colonialism wants to put us in all these little boxes and silos, and it's not a true representation of how we traditionally did things.
Mhm. Well, blood quantum. Can you talk a little bit about blood quantum? And I know it means nothing to you, but it does mean something to becoming a member. Is that correct?
It's long game genocide. So
Right.
yeah, most tribes are required to have a blood quantum, which is a percentage of Indian blood to determine whether you can be enrolled or not. But it didn't even become a thing until 1887 or whenever it was that the Dawes Act was enacted in the United States as a means to privatize indigenous lands, and they just determined that, well, if you're a certain percentage of Indian blood, you're competent to be a private landowner. You're competent to be properly civilized so that you can join our society. And it was all an effort to strip land. So we didn't care about blood percentage up until that point, and it continues to be, I would say, the most divisive issue in Indian country, something that absolutely has to be thrown out because there is no such thing as Indian blood. My blood is no different than yours. And we never determined our tribal relationships through anything related to blood. Tribes would take prisoners from another tribe in battle. And, if say my son is killed in this conflict and I have this young man from the other tribe that we were in conflict with, then essentially that young man becomes my son in a replacement of this role that we needed fulfilled in my family that has been lost because of this conflict. Marriage, from whether from another tribe or even, some of the best information we have is because of the story of John Tanner, who was a white guy in like Ohio who was captured by the Shawnee and traded to the Ojibwe and grew up Ojibwe. And his autobiography, as told to someone who was literate, because Tanner wasn't, from the the mid 1800s on is kind of the best picture we have of what life was like, because he was Ojibwe as far as he was concerned and as far as his people were concerned. So this whole notion of trying to measure it by blood and race is actually antithetical to our entire worldview. And the fact that so many Indian people still double down on that is an indicator of how colonized we still are, and that we need to break those chains that have been inflicted on us by the occupier.
Marriage at one time in Canada, if an Indigenous woman married a white man, she lost her treaty rights altogether. And it wasn't until I think the 1980s, these women that were Native that had been married to a white
Mm-hmm.
man actually were able to gain their treaty rights back. And that is how my ex-husband got his treaty rights back, was through his mother, because
Mm-hmm.
she was three quarters, three quarter, you could call it quantum blood. She was fluent in Cree, and her family was fluent in Cree, and yet she did not teach her children. And it's the same with what you're saying, Chris. She did not teach her children because she was also in a residential school
Mm-hmm.
when she was educated. And then she married a white man. And so it was not in her best interest at that time to raise her children fluent in Cree. Yeah, unfortunately, my children, they're not embracing that side of the family's heritage at all. And yet, it's in their DNA. You talk in the book about you believe your ancestors walk with you and actually helped with, maybe sat beside you at the signing, the final signing in January of 2020, right? How
That
that
was our
all,
celebration party.
right. And that because of, you were doing the work that they were unable to do at that time because of the situation that they were in, you helped to get that all done.
I don't know how much I helped to in the effort for our federal restoration. I'm kind of a late arrival to that. It was certainly going on when I was first getting involved. I wouldn't take any credit at all for that, but I do have a role in telling the story up to that point and beyond. So yeah.
There's a quote in the book that says, generations stacked up against us who chose to disavow where they came from so that future generations wouldn't have to endure what they did.
Hmm.
I think that speaks a lot to that story of your history, as well as the story of my in-laws as well.
Hmm.
So in the book, you talk about how Catholicism predated missionaries, and
Yeah.
how Catholicism came with the Métis people from the Pembina area, and actually even from Ontario, and moved westward. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, Catholicism arrived in late 1600s when, Rupert's Land is established, the Hudson Bay Company, and those first traders, the first people who moving into what is now Manitoba, and Winnipeg was the original Red River settlement. So when those first guys show up, they're voyageurs who'd already been trading on the eastern side of the Great Lakes with people. And, they would stop in Montreal on their way into the interior and make offerings to Saint Anne, who was the patron saint of like good weather and travel and all that stuff. So when they arrive and they start establishing these trading posts, they bring Catholicism with them. And this is the late 1600s. And, they start as per tradition, whether it's with Europeans or with other Indian tribes, we would only trade with people who were family. So the first thing that happens in order to initiate this trade relationship, which both sides recognized was beneficial to their communities and their families, those first marriages produced children who are like the first generation of what ultimately we come to know as the Métis people. And that's a very simplified definition. But, they have not, the native tribes of the region have not converted to Catholicism at this point. They have added it to our we're not a monotheistic culture. We have spirits and everything. Everything has a spirit. And we think we hear these stories of this guy Jesus who's supposedly pretty spectacular, and like, well, it's a tough place to live. We'll take whatever spiritual power we can. in order to survive. So it becomes integrated with traditional indigenous cosmology. And that goes on until, the early, like 1819, 1820 is when the first missionaries show up. So there's this beautiful, what the Canadian scholar, Emily Pigeon, I guess is how you pronounce her name, wrote about what she calls lived Catholicism, where it's just part of your life. It's not dictated by the church in Rome, telling you what to do. So when those first missionaries show up in 1820, and they look at this community with marriages and kids, and there's an element of Catholicism to it, and it's working beautifully, and they're like, oh, we can't have this. You need to either remarry under the authority of us, or you're sinners and you're going to go to hell. So the arrival of the missionaries and the doubling down by the Catholic Church to hammer all these people into line is really the beginning of the conflict era.
Yeah. And led the way to boarding schools, residential schools,
Oh, sure.
whatever you want to call it.
They establish schools as soon as they get there. Now, they aren't what we
Right.
would consider the boarding school era. That comes later, but schools was one of the first weapons used to disconnect Indigenous children from their cultural heritage, and kind of remake the societies that were already, existing there.
In your book, you talk about Hill 57 outside of Great Falls.
Mhm.
To me, it sounds like the landing pad for the next UFO, right? But there's a whole different story around that, Chris. Can you tell the story of Hill 57 and why it was so important to the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians and how that actually eventually was created?
Hill 57 is named because it's this rocky, barren hillside on kind of the northwest edge of what is Great Falls now. So back in the day, it would have been much farther out from where the main town was. And it was called Hill 57 because, like in the 30s, the 1930s, there was a guy who was a pickle salesman who worked for Heinz, and him and his family would go up and they would picnic up there. And over time, they arranged these rocks and whitewashed them so there's a big number 57 on the hillside as like a advertisement for his business. So it became to be known as Hill 57, and the people living there were the Hill 57 Indians because it was, a place outside of town. And, we're already 30 years 30 to 50 years into our diaspora, and we're living on the fringes of communities, and we could live there and not be bothered. And it was considered a place of abject poverty and such. But at the same time, it was also a place because it was removed from the main community. And you have to remember that at this point in history, it's illegal for Indigenous people to practice ceremonies or traditional healing or any of those things. We wave sage to smudge all the time now, but at that point, it was illegal for us to do that. But on Hill 57, you could, because there weren't any authorities there. So other tribal people from all over the region would come there so that they could do ceremonies, they can get traditional healing and all that. So, on the one hand, you kind of see what you're looking for. So if you're a white bureaucrat, and you look at that, all you see is poverty and illness. If you're a native person, you see a place where you can kind of do what you've been doing for generations under the radar and not get hassled, not go to jail for it. So even today, so Hill 57 is connected to this other hillside called Mount Royal. And the Little Shell, we own a bunch of land up there now. And our powwow grounds are there. And we have been buying up area around there to, our community centers right at the base of Hill 57. So it's a very important landmark in the history of our survival.
Mhm. And that's what I found in the book. Throughout the book, you went to sites, sacred sites, where you found a real connection to the land for whatever reason. And I'm getting goosebumps right now as I talk about it. And I always know that's, you know, otherworldly, I should say it. But you talk about
I
when
would
you
call
went,
that interworldly. By calling
oh,
it otherworldly, we're looking at it as something separate, but it's not. It's
no.
part of our world. So yeah, I would call that interworldly.
Yeah, the sacred sites that you go to, you talked about the Buffalo Jump site. We have
Hmm.
one here in Alberta that's also a sacred site, a Buffalo Jump site, and another site, I believe it was either in Minnesota or North Dakota, where you just walked out onto the land away from the lights and just
Hmm.
experienced under the stars the way that would be. And there's other places in the book where you talk about the connection you felt to the land. And I think it's important for our viewers to really understand that, Chris. What is the connection to the land that Indigenous people have that, as a settler, we don't. We see land
Hmm.
as profit, right? And that's why you have land so that you can grow stuff to have a profit. If it's not going to be land that you can harvest from, you probably wouldn't buy it. But why, for Indigenous people, is land so meaningful?
I think there are plenty of settler people who have been in a place for a long time that can experience that as well. What we have that we're trying to stir back up again is our language that ties us and totally changes our relationship. And without our language, we are just a fraction of what that connection really is. I don't want to suggest that other people who have come here don't have that connection. And I think a perfect kind of literary example of that is Wabgishig Rice, who is Canadian, from a reserve up north, has written a couple wonderful kind of post-apocalyptic books. His first one is called Moon of the Crusted Snow, which we are in the moon of the crusted snow right now. And he, it's the end of, you never really know what happened, but it's on a reserve in northern Canada. And it's kind of the conflict between when they're forced to kind of go back to subsistence living. Some people who've stayed connected to the land and those traditions fare one way, and the people who have abandoned them fare a different way. So that relationship is something that we share with settlers as well. Now, at our best, um, representation of ourselves, where we have our language and everything, yes, absolutely. The land, we are tied to the land in a way that just as English speakers, we never can be, or nobody can be. But it's where we've lived. I mean, think about people, rural people who have multiple generations on in a certain space, and you come to recognize every blade of grass and every tree and every more than human relative who moves through there. It's something we share. We have way more in common, settler and indigenous person, than we don't. And it's the focusing on the things that we have in common that I think is important, and less so trying to draw these boundaries like, well, we're more connected than you ever can be. Well, to a certain degree, perhaps, but that doesn't move us forward. That just continues to keep people in their separate boxes when we're here now living together. And that's how we should have been for a long time, for forever. And we were for a long time, in those first 100 years or so of the creation of the Métis people and all of that. So I think it's important to recognize that's something we share. Connection to the land is something we share. You just have to embrace it. You just have to spend time, and it's an active uh, dedication to reconnecting to the land, whether you're indigenous or not. And I think we can all do that.
Mhm. Yeah. And I hope that we do. When you mentioned the connection of the language to the land, and that actually some of the words themselves are only understandable through an understanding of the relationship to Indigenous people with the land. I think about ceremony as well, Chris, because I teach for the University of Alberta, and many of the students that I teach are on a reservation, or they're people that with some type of Indigenous blood. I try to do my programming in such a way so that I learn, right? And that's how I got to know about you. And I just typed in Métis, right? Because I wanted to learn more about the Métis, and it comes up, the Irritable Métis. So, and that is your blog. So why do you call yourself the Irritable Métis?
Well, because I'm an easily irritated Métis person, and it just has a nice ring to it. people meet me in person, they think, you're not as irritable as you seem to be, but I guess that's a good thing.
How important do you feel that celebration, powwows, the regalia is to the health, mental health, emotional health, physical health of the Indigenous people as a whole?
It's critical. Yeah, it's absolutely critical. There's a reason it was denied us. Because when we are at our best selves with our ceremonies and our languages and all of our ways of looking at the world, we are a mighty people. So there's a reason why, and it's not just in Turtle Island, it's all around the globe. That's the first thing that colonial powers go after, separating people from their heritage, because when we are connected to who we have been for countless generations, we're mighty. So yeah, returning to that is important. And I think, our worldview is part of what we need to overcome this kind of brink that we've pushed ourselves to as humans. And I think inviting more people to our way of looking at the world and our ceremonies and our connections is kind of the path that we take to pull ourselves back from the brink.
And I participated in a pipe ceremony for the
Hmm.
first time just last fall. It was beautiful. I was welcomed because I was an instructor. I had never experienced one before, and it was inside a teepee, and there were probably about 40 of us that all were affiliated with the University of Alberta. And it really was powerful, very spiritual and very powerful. And Chris, I am Catholic. I head down to the church pretty much every Sunday, right? Um, do I really believe everything about the church? Absolutely not. However, I do love that sense of calm and togetherness. And there are some rituals within the church that mean a lot to me, and that might be handed down from my ancestors, right? But that pipe ceremony was amazing. And I urge anyone who gets an opportunity to be invited to a powwow or a ceremony of some kind to do it, because it enriches your life, it enriches your own spirituality. So I was grateful for that.
So it's carrying multiple truths at the same time.
Yeah. And doing the best we can to help change what's going on, feet on the ground, right? It's the people with
Hmm.
feet on the ground, those of us that are teaching Indigenous children or their parents in whatever level we're teaching in,
Hmm.
and just trying our best to reconcile as best we can for the ill deeds that were done and to admit the ill deeds, right? Uh,
And are still done.
right? And so are still
It
done.
hasn't stopped. It's just
No,
changed face a little bit.
yeah, yeah, you're right. And just trying to reconcile as best we can. My children were baptized Catholic, and they don't go to church at all. That's their own choice. But their dad is Catholic. So it's hard to separate that whole thing. It's also culture, part culture as well. So that's how it is for me. So tell me about your one sentence journal. You won awards for it, as well as the book you've just written, but tell us about your one sentence journal.
Well, that just was the first book that I ever published, and it's kind of what, I'd never considered myself a poet. And, when that book came out, it's mostly poems, and people started calling me a poet. So I embraced that. And came out August 14th, 2018. And then it was August 14th, 2023, 5 years to the day that I got a call from the Montana state governor telling me that he was appointing me Montana State Poet Laureate. So, that book opened a lot of doors for me. And, I wouldn't be sitting here right now if it wasn't for that book, I don't think. So, it's a little thing, and I still have a lot of gratitude towards that.
And what does it mean to be a poet laureate?
It means I'm the official poet of the state of Montana.
And so so what would you do in that role?
I often say bad things about the governor and everybody else that we've elected. I don't know. That's kind of facetious, but I do programs for kids. I do programs for adults. I travel all over the state. There's really nothing that I'm supposed to be doing. I think other poets laureate that we've had, I'm the 11th that Montana has had, have had to specify certain projects that they were going to do. It's an unpaid role, so it's just an honorific, really. But, when I was appointed, the Montana Arts Council, who kind of runs the program, just said, just keep doing what you're doing. Because I was already doing a lot of stuff on the road talking about the little shell. And, so like I was in a school. I mean, literally all over the state, I visit schools is kind of the most common thing I do. And there's often, if I'm in a school during the day, then I'll arrange to have some kind of an event for adults in that evening at a museum or a library or a bookstore or anywhere that people. I was in a little theater a couple weeks ago. So yeah, it's just an opportunity to get out and talk to people.
Do you allow yourself to do these things outside of winter? Because traditionally, storytelling was only done in the winter, right?
Well, we tell stories all year round. There's just certain stories that you don't tell outside of winter. So I there's some traditional stories I tell, but a lot of times I'm just reading poetry, or like next week I have to go and do a keynote address at a Minnesota Indian Education Association conference. So things like that I do. But no, I don't tell stories out of season that you shouldn't, but we're not unable to tell other stories no matter what time of year it is.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder because you're a storyteller, right? You're a storyteller, Métis storyteller. So where does it's only specific stories you can't tell outside of winter,
Correct.
right? Okay. So when you're going to Minnesota, are you going to see Robin Wall Kimmerer?
No, she's in New York. I might see James Vukolich Kagagabo, who is another very popular and active Anishinaabe linguist and educator. I'm really excited because one of the evening events is they're going to show the version of Star Wars that's been redone in Anishinaabemowin. So all the speaking is in Anishinaabemowin. So I'm really excited to see that. I'm not around Anishinaabe people very often where I live, so I'm really looking forward to kind of being immersed in that for a few days at least.
Right. And hearing that language on the screen for, well, was whatever Star Wars is over 2 hours.
So I teach one class at the University of Montana a week, and I told my students last night that my goal was to come back and be able to come into the and drop some Darth Vader lines in Anishinaabe on them, So I'm
Oh
looking forward to
gosh, you gotta have that. You've got to have
that.
the lightsaber.
Yeah.
Well, this show is all about hope. So, what is your last message of hope for people that are viewing and maybe some of our Indigenous friends that might be watching or listening to it?
I want people to be engaged at whatever level they're comfortable with. And it's not it's it's an active, it's a verb, and you have to select some way that you're going to interact with the world in an effort to improve it or make it better for somebody else. I'm interested in people defining some things that they're going to do differently in their life a little bit at a time to have a positive impact on everybody else. And I think it's the small, our lives are lived with the tiny moments. That's what makes our lives. And I think our efforts to improve the world are a combination of everybody making at least tiny efforts. And, it could be as simple as you're not turning off your subscriptions to Amazon Prime and Netflix and all of these people that, line up behind these despots that are trying to ruin the world and take everything for themselves. That requires a bit of sacrifice. And we all need to sacrifice a little bit, I think, because so many people have had to sacrifice to create this standard of living that everybody takes for granted. And that's unconscionable. And we need to change that. And that starts with each person, not anticipating that somebody else is going to do something to solve the problems for us.
Feet on the ground, hands working. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Yeah. So thank you, Chris Miigwech, for
Yeah,
all you,
miigwech.
yeah, for meeting us here today, and for all the work you're doing, and for your message of empowerment. I guess it would
Hmm.
be your message of empowerment, and doing everything you can to make things right, right? Or the best that we can to make things right the way they
The
should
best that
have.
we can, yes.
Yeah, best that we
And
can.
remember that the best we can is usually a little bit farther than we thought it was.
It's always outside the comfort zone.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you again. And
Hmm.
if you liked what you heard today, please subscribe. It will help me and it will help Chris to spread his message and help him with his book sales. And if you haven't read it yet and you're interested in what we said, Becoming a Little Shell is Chris's latest book. And it is available wherever you are, even in
Hmm.
the wilds of Canada. So thank you, Chris. Miigwech, good luck with
Miigwech,
everything
thank
you
you.
do. This podcast and Inspired Healing Hypnotherapy do not provide medical advice. The information included here is not limited to text, graphics, images, or other material contained, and are for informational purposes only. No material in this podcast is intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment, and before undertaking a new healthcare regimen, and never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this site.